There's a national healthcare agreement between the Commonwealth and all of the states and territories, and this is a part of it, P116, potentially avoidable deaths for the year 2021. Draw attention to the bottom left-hand side there. It's got an indicator set. Won't look across. It was actually agreed to on the 19th of November 2020, which is around 10 to even up to 12 months if you want to go back to the start of 2020, since the government and alongside media had reported that COVID-19 was a pandemic. Now, it may be surprising to most Australians that a disease name they were told by politicians, highly paid government bureaucrats, health professionals, health bodies like the AMA, and prolifically unqualified media personalities had to be avoided no matter what the cost, was not listed as a potentially avoidable disease in an official government health agreement, presumably arrived at on verifiable evidence, 10 months into a pandemic period that lasted for around 3 years, and in some medical circles is apparently still ongoing. Viral pneumonia and influenza are included, and one might say because the symptoms are the same, COVID comes under that, but those ICD-10 codes are different for influenza as compared to COVID-19. Let's just point out codes Y60 to Y69, incompetence and negligence are creatively referred to as misadventures, which includes medical care. So they could claim that, any adverse reactions to a certain jab were just misadventures. The question could also be asked, are these lipid nanoparticles medical devices or medicines? Because they operate by entering a cell, physically changing the properties inside of it, much like, say, a scalpel, which is a medical device. When it cuts into you, it's affecting the cells in a physical manner. But fully approved vaccines don't behave in that manner. They don't physically change any cells, as does most medicines, which interact with the pathogen itself. It's an appropriate question in relation to this agreement revelation to all Australian government health departments, AMA, etc. Why is a disease described as a pandemic subject to an all-of-government intervention that affected every single Australian not a potentially avoidable disease? Is it that, as detailed in this document, that the criteria of a potentially avoidable disease is that it only goes up to the age of 74, and that the average age of death reported for COVID was actually 86, well above life expectancy? It could certainly elicit a yes or no answer based on whether that was the case. So all Commonwealth, state and territory health departments, actually all governments, all parliaments, they could be asked this question: why were draconian intervention measures imposed on all Australians to mitigate a disease not listed as potentially avoidable by health department experts, presumably due to the death occurring beyond life expectancy? So all governments had determined by agreement that it wasn't potentially avoidable. Well, what were all these border restrictions affecting business, important family ceremonies and families going on holidays? There were cases where people couldn't visit loved ones in other states who were dying, and even restrictions on movements within states. So what was their reasoning for imposing all that devastation on almost the entire population when they had already agreed that it wasn't a potentially avoidable disease? It didn't meet that criteria for whatever reason. The only reason appears to be is that you had to be over the age of life expectancy to die. So the second question for that group: why did health departments participate in a Defence Department-run program to inject Australians with experimental pharmaceutical company-sponsored products? So I'm being very careful with my words here, because I don't even know if they were devices or medicines, to prevent a disease that was not potentially avoidable. And I've got sponsored because there's not even confirmation that they were supplied by Pfizer and Co, and indeed, even if they held the patents. This was Operation COVID Shield. As a military operation run by the Defence Department by this guy appointed. I'm just going to read the second sentence of the first paragraph. In this role, I have direct operational control of all relevant assets and resources across the Commonwealth. So that is movement of them, and could extend to, because he has control of the assets. Like I said, there's a reason why I use the word sponsored and not supplied, because sponsored is the word that appears in the TGA records for these products. Now, the third question is, I actually left a bit out at the end, but I'll just add it in the oration. Why did state and territory governments impose crippling social and business restrictive measures to coerce Australians against their better judgment and consent intentions to be injected with experimental pharmaceutical company-sponsored products, the bit I left out, for a disease that was not potentially avoidable? This is one example of the coercive measures. There were many, many more across all states. I've covered consent in other videos. I'm going too much here, but this effectively, consent has to be freely given. And it's not freely given, even if the slightest coercion, that takes away the word freely given. It's completely gone. So just hark back to the fact that it's a military operation, and I don't think consent came into it. Well, it looks like it didn't. It's only a question for Treasury, and even subpoena Josh Frydenberg back to answer some questions at any inquiries. Why did they spend $17 billion on confidential contracts for a disease that was not potentially avoidable? If it's not avoidable, why would you take the measure? Remember, the time of the agreement was the end of 2020, before the second part of the devastation on Australians, first part being the intervention measures and second part being these jabs. These questions would be ideal for some of those Senate hearings where I see Rennick and Antic and Malcolm Roberts had dragged Phil Lowe back in, or the RBA board. Why did the RBA deposit in excess of $400 billion? Oh, that was such a hit. This is probably financially the most devastating of all of their measures into foreign and substantially foreign-owned Australian banks, exchange settlement accounts that will ultimately be drawn from public funds, because it's only on the balance sheet of the RBA. They claim that we created out of nothing. Well, they sort of do, but it's still accounted for in that it eventually gets paid down by borrowing, increasing the debt and causing intergenerational extreme hardship, debt and more debt, and a monetary response to a disease that the RBA could have determined through minimal inquiry to be not potentially avoidable. Oh, hang on a minute. We can't avoid it anyway. Oh, listen, don't worry about doing this. And I'll just finish up. I only found this document a little while ago, by the way. All these things, amazing, all the different things that come up in your searches. So the questions are obviously retrospective, but important to cover and make sure it doesn't happen again. I'm working on my Substack. I'm doing a heap of articles simultaneously, so I'll have quite a few to release each week. And one of them is called Remedies and Reparations. And I figure under reparations, I'd love to, you know how the Americans are sanctioning individual Russians during this, nonsense that's going off over in Ukraine. Well, nonsense, yeah, it makes no sense, but it's going to impact us. Devastating for sure, especially when they bring in the China phase of it. I'd like to be able to sanction all these individuals, Greg Hunt, Josh Frydenberg, and seize their estates, and because that's you can be able to trace it easily, and just send them back to square one. Just take off anything they've ever earned while they were in government. That's reparations for the damage that they caused to consolidated revenue and the national accounts, public funds. I'm compiling a list of COVID perpetrators in case we manage to cease government and go down that path. It includes people you haven't heard of for a while now. Certainly Louise McClure, Jane Holton, and Jodie McVernon, the modeller. I've got all the videos of her sprouting off her modelling nonsense that was out by a factor of 50, and yet there was no evidence. That's what I think Brad Hazard. Now, all these guys, Skerritt's going to be fleeing the scene very soon. Apparently his appointment finishes. Well, he might be gone, but he won't be forgotten. All right, that's it for this one.